The NBA is full of type A personalities. No one reaches the pros without being aggressive, assertive, and full of energy. It's no surprise that fights tend to break out. It's also no surprise that ejections have been part of the rules since the very beginning. Keep watching to learn about some of the best NBA fights and ejections of all time. Charles Barkley and Shaquille O'Neal. Fights are always shocking. They're even more shocking when they break out between two of the league's biggest stars. This is exactly what happened in November 1999. The league best Los Angeles Lakers were in Houston, where a 36-year-old Charles Barkley was struggling to lead his Rockets team into playoff territory. With a dynamic duo of Kobe and Shaq and head coach Phil Jackson, the Lakers were heavily favored to win the matchup. Surprisingly, Houston managed to put up a fight and only lose by a single point, 89-88. However, during the second quarter, something even more surprising happened that would make headlines around the sports world. After Barkley was fouled by Shaq under the rim, the two got into a scuffle. Barkley threw the ball at O'Neal's head. This enraged O'Neal, who took a full swing at Barkley's face. The punch didn't land, but it was enough to incite an all-out brawl between the two players. Immediately, players from both teams came running over to break up the fight. The officials began frantically blowing their whistles, and the Houston crowd erupted. The moment was sensational. Not just because it took place between two of the game's most notorious big men, it was also emotionally charged for the fans in attendance. In Houston, the Lakers were seen as enemies. Head coach Phil Jackson was particularly unpopular. He had been behind much of the suffering and disappointment for the Rockets over the past decade. It's often forgotten that the Houston Rockets won back-to-back championships in the 90s. In 94 and 95, the league was transformed by the retirement of Michael Jordan and the retreat of the Chicago Bulls. Even though the teams belong in different conferences, this shift still created the opportunity for Houston to succeed in ways they never could while Jordan was with the Bulls. It's also forgotten that in the 1995 NBA Finals, the Rockets played against the Orlando Magic, whose star player was none other than 23-year-old Shaquille O'Neal. Now, 4 years later, the coach who had tormented them for a decade and the player who had vied for their second title were both paired together on the best team in the NBA. The city of Houston was anxious to see the Lakers' downfall. To this day, it's not clear who started the fight. Some blame O'Neal for batting his arm down after the whistle had already been blown. Others blame Barkley for provoking O'Neal and hitting him with the ball. According to O'Neal, it was Barkley who instigated the fight. He did one of his Charles Barkley-like stupid things, and I just reacted, O'Neal said. Anytime a person gets hit in the face with the ball, 9 times out of 10, he'll probably just react. React? O'Neal certainly did. He was immediately ejected from the game for trying to punch Barkley. Believe it or not, that was actually the second time O'Neal had been ejected, that same week. Just days prior in Portland, O'Neal had received 2 technical fouls for excess physical play, resulting in an automatic ejection. Coach Phil Jackson was disappointed in his star center's behavior. "You can't act like that," he said. "If you act like that, they can run you out of any game just by creating a situation." The Lakers went on to win the 2000 NBA championship, and O'Neal was crowned Finals MVP. The brawl with Barkley was ultimately just a bump on the road, but it left behind an incredible mark and is still one of the most iconic fights in NBA history. That being said, it is far from the only one. Jeff Van Gundy, Marcus Camby, and Danny Ferry. When violence breaks out in the middle of a game, it's usually between players. Not always, however. In 2001, the New York Knicks were playoff contenders under head coach Jeff Van Gundy. The team had just come off a 13-point victory over the Portland Trail Blazers and were favored to beat the San Antonio Spurs at the Garden 2 days later. On January 14, 2001, tip-off began in New York City. The game played out mostly how everyone expected. By the final minutes of the fourth quarter, the Knicks were sitting comfortably on a 20-point lead over San Antonio. However, comfort was soon to leave the building. With just under 3.5 minutes left in regulation, Kurt Thomas missed a jumper and the Spurs collected the rebound. At the same time, 2 key players were tussling under the hoop for the rebound. The Spurs' Danny Ferry and the Knicks' 6'11 center, Marcus Camby. Ferry hit Camby in the face during the tussle. It's not clear whether this was done on purpose, but it was enough for the officials to blow the whistle. It was also enough to infuriate Camby, who stormed up court towards Ferry and had to be intercepted by multiple referees. Camby appeared to calm down after being met by the officials near center court. He could be seen pleading with them and explaining that he was hit near his eye. Meanwhile, Ferry strolled off to the sidelines. To anyone watching, it looked like the situation had de-escalated. Then, suddenly, without warning, Camby exploded toward the sidelines with his fist raised. Ferry was his obvious target, but as Camby leapt towards him and swung his fist, it was Camby's own head coach, 40-year-old, 5'9" Jeff Van Gundy, who stood in the way and absorbed the brunt of Camby's attack. Van Gundy crashed to the floor and was clearly hurt. He may have even been knocked out for a few moments, although this hasn't been confirmed publicly. Van Gundy was helped off the court with blood running down his face, and he ended up needing more than a dozen stitches over his left eye. Camby was ejected from the game and was condemned around the league for his actions. Although he probably didn't mean to hit his own coach, the fact that he did was seen as inexcusable. The league suspended him for 5 straight games and fined him $25,000, which was a lot more in 2001 than it is today. To the amazement of many, Jeff Van Gundy of all people came forward to criticize the punishment. He was concerned that such a long absence would hurt the Knicks' chances in the playoffs. He told ESPN, "I'm not here to try to defend Marcus. What he did was wrong, and he admitted that. But clearly the punishment doesn't fit his actions. It hurts us, and it hurts our chances of winning." Camby also forfeited more than $300,000 in salary during his suspension. Others supported Van Gundy's complaint that the punishment was too harsh, including the Knicks' Latrell Sprewell. However, nobody defended Camby's actions. But if you thought that was crazy, wait until you see what happened to Jeff Van Gundy 3 years earlier. Jeff Van Gundy, Alonzo Mourning, and Larry Johnson. Jeff Van Gundy became the head coach of the Knicks in 1996 during the heyday of Knicks playoff basketball. In 1998, the Knicks were matched up against the Miami Heat in the first round. Many favored the Heat to win the series. They had a better regular season record and home court advantage. It turned out to be a close series, despite the fact that Miami was second in the Eastern Conference and New York was only 7th. Game 4 was held in Madison Square Garden in front of 20,000 screaming Knicks fans. Miami was up 2-1. Back then, the first round playoff series were best of 5, not best of 7. Miami only needed one more victory to move on and send the Knicks packing. The whole game was close, right up to the final minute. The Knicks would eventually squeeze out a victory, but only after a massive brawl. The violence broke out between Miami's Alonzo Mourning and New York's Larry Johnson late in the fourth quarter. Larry Johnson and Alonzo Mourning had formerly been teammates on the Charlotte Hornets, but their relationship had long since soured. After a missed three-pointer by Tim Hardaway, both Johnson and Mourning simultaneously began swinging their fists at each other. Head coach Jeff Van Gundy leapt into action and attempted to put his body between two guys twice his size. Similar to the event 3 years later, Van Gundy was instantly knocked to the ground. Only this time, he clung to Alonzo Mourning's leg and proceeded to be dragged around by the angry 6'10" center. As the rest of the players swarmed around the action, Van Gundy was in an extremely vulnerable position. He's lucky he wasn't trampled. Eventually, the fight was broken up and the Knicks completed their 90-85 victory. Both Johnson and Mourning were ejected, even though the fight broke out with only a few seconds left in regulation. As you can expect, both players were suspended for 2 games and fined. Mourning was fined $20,000, while Johnson was only fined $10,000. This is reportedly because it was Mourning who threw the first punch. This was certainly one of the most dramatic one-on-one brawls in NBA history. However, we haven't even gotten to team-on-team brawls yet. Keep watching to find out about 2 of the worst team brawls ever seen in professional basketball. The Denver Nuggets versus the New York Knicks. Fast forward to 2006, once again, Madison Square Garden will become the site of one of the greatest fights in NBA history. In December of 2001, less than a year after getting slammed by Marcus Camby, Jeff Van Gundy resigned from coaching the Knicks. He was replaced by Don Chaney. It's not clear how much of this was Chaney's fault, but the transition marked a steep decline in Knicks basketball. After making the playoffs for 13 straight years, the Knicks failed to make the playoffs again until 2004. This small victory didn't amount to much though. They were swept in the first round by the New Jersey Nets. The Knicks wouldn't make the playoffs again until 2011, and in 2006, fans in New York City were pissed. The team has since gone through a revolving door of different coaches. Isaiah Thomas became the new head coach in 2016. In the beginning, things seemed to be improving, but in December of 2016, things turned gruesome during a blowout loss to the Denver Nuggets. Late in the fourth quarter, the Nuggets' J.R. Smith was driving to the hoop on a fast break, hoping to put the Nuggets up by 21 points with just over a minute left to play. Unexpectedly, Marty Collins ran up behind JR and committed a flagrant foul. JR was sent flying out of bounds, but within seconds, he was on his feet again in a rage. The next thing anybody knew, the whole floor was in a fist fight. The Knicks' Nate Robinson was the first to arrive and join, followed by the rest of the Knicks and soon the rest of the Nuggets as well. J.R. Smith and Nate Robinson went crashing into the bleachers. Pretty soon, players from both teams were leaping from their benches and running over. Carmelo Anthony punched Marty Collins directly in the face. Both coaches, in particular Isaiah Thomas, were widely criticized as well. Thomas was accused of aggravating the Nuggets by using similar tactics from his time on the bad boy Pistons. Nuggets head coach George Karl was blamed for leaving his starting players in the game even late in the fourth quarter after it was clear the game was over. Neither coach was penalized, but the game marked a historic moment in NBA history. All 10 players were ejected. Not only that, 7 of those 10 players were issued suspensions. Carmelo Anthony was suspended for 15 games, one of the longest suspensions of all time. Players lost over $1 million in salary from this one event. On top of that, both teams were fined $500,000. Not only was this one of the most insane fights in NBA history, it turned out to be one of the most expensive as well. But even this fight is nothing compared to what's coming next. The Detroit Pistons versus the Indiana Pacers. The greatest fight in NBA history is, without a doubt, the one that took place on November 19, 2004 at the Palace of Auburn Hills. Known as the Malice at the Palace, this is by far the most famous brawl to ever happen in a basketball game, and for good reason. It's the only time both players and fans were involved, and it's the only time officials had to end the game early because of chaos in the arena. Most people think Ron Artest started the fight after a hard foul he made against Ben Wallace. Wallace turned around and shoved Artest, and within seconds, a major fight ensued. Artest ended up charging into the stands and attacking a fan after a drink was thrown at him. The NBA gave Artest the longest suspension in history, 86 games. While the Pacers were trying to leave the arena, Detroit fans threw drinks, bottles, popcorn, and even a folding chair at the players and coaches. A group of fans also ran down into the tunnel and blocked their path. Overall, the mayhem resulted in 9 players getting suspended and a loss of $11 million in salaries. 5 of the 9 players also faced legal consequences, including assault charges. 9 spectators were injured, including 2 who had to be hospitalized. This was such a disaster that the NBA decided to make rule changes immediately afterwards. These included increased security and limited alcohol sales at all future NBA games. It's unlikely we'll ever see a fight of this magnitude again. The Malice at the Palace will live on as one of the most dangerous moments in professional sports for decades to come.